When cultures intertwine, there's a pressing issue: employment inequality. Despite advancements in labor markets, disparities persist. Our women, young people, persons with disabilities, the elderly, and indigenous populations face disproportionate challenges and struggle for inclusion. But change is on the horizon. Now we'll explore new findings and propose actionable measures for closing gaps in our regional labor market. We will highlight the potential impact of employment equity on economic growth and development. And we'll learn how innovative policies and approaches can shape the future of work. Let's partner to build a more inclusive and equitable Caribbean labor market. The collaboration starts now.
Welcome, everyone, and in particular to our live stream audiences on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube, to this very important conversation on labor markets in the Caribbean. And in particular, we'd like to share some of our findings on a very important study that looks at gender differentials in the job market throughout the region. I am now inviting Dindil Ramatan, the chief researcher on this project, to the podium.
Thank you and good day all. It's a pleasure to be here and to run through these findings as we get into today's discussion. Just to set the tone, what we'll be looking at is the labor market in the Caribbean region, how it impacts and how our various subpopulations are impacted by the presence of inequity, of diseconomies of scale sometimes in achieving and accessing the labor market and operating and engaging with the labor market. The presentation today will deliver some of the key findings from our research. And what I want to highlight in this research is, in being such a product of an uninvestigated area in the region, it continues to raise questions. And we actually see this as one of the main benefits we can bring now with this research. I want to contextualize what we see in the data. This is a cursory and a high-level interaction for the first time with indigenous populations, with gender, with age, with disability in our regional labor markets. So while it may not be to the depth of research or the representative samples we've been accustomed to, what the research does is uses a purposive sampling method where we target these populations to make sure that they are represented in the findings. As we bring out these findings and we raise questions of access, we raise questions of allocation, we raise questions of opportunity, we expect to then go deeper with those particular populations. This triangulation that we did focused on a quantitative survey methodology, but also interacting with the persons who are affected. We triangulated with quantitative and qualitative approaches to make sure we don't respond only at an aggregate level, but we bring the stories from the field. The studies were conducted in 15 borrowing member countries of CDB. And it's critical to know some of our countries who are grappling with data deficiencies may not be reporting frequently on labor markets. We made sure to include them so we could start the conversation, raise these questions, and bring solutions that are meaningful. We don't want to lose sight that this is encapsulated in a large discussion. We have Agenda 2030. There's no hiding from the fact, all of us in the room would have said it at some point, the targets and goals under the SDG Agenda 2030 may not all be met. And we have to realize there will be life beyond 2030. And this gives us that baseline to go beyond, to look at the concepts that focuses on addressing the employment gap, making sure we have productive, fair access to employment, rewarding work. It focuses on the rights gap, looking at the collective bargaining process, opportunity, safety, and protection. It focuses on the social dialogue gap, and this looks at voice, representation, and communication, and social protection, retirement, pensions, healthcare, and disability support. One of the beautiful parts of this research, we engage with trade unions, we engage with employers, we engage with policymakers. It's a cohesive and inclusive approach to blend all these voices. Even within the bank, this is a partnership between the economics department and the social sector division to ensure that economic growth and development is partnered with social protection and inclusivity. In that regard, I want to mention Ms. Famala Jacobs and Mr. Greg Nunes, who worked on the project alongside us. There's a big interconnectiveness of the SDGs. When we focus on one SDG, we are in fact addressing different parts along the 17 goals. So I don't want us to leave here thinking this is only a discussion on labor markets. Because if we are able to connect the dots within the labor markets, we are also able to address SDG 1, which is no poverty, to address SDG 4, which is inclusive and equitable quality education and lifelong learning, SDG 5, SDG 10. It's important to contextualize what we do in that dynamic. Going into the data, we've all seen this chart in many different ways. The fact that we do know there are more men participating in the labor force. And the questions that came up in the research is why. And I want to start by saying we have to recontextualize how we measure labor force participation. Unpaid care work, support to families is important and part of the economic concept. And that needs to come out as we go forward. We live in aging societies. The Caribbean actually is one of the fastest aging society in the developing world. And going to yesterday's discussion last night, we didn't plan for it to connect so well. But when the chart was put up about what the aging population means for Jamaica, that is a reality for the majority of the region. We've made advances in health, which has lowered our death rate. But we've also, through the participation in labor markets, through the cost of living, our birth rates are falling. Many of our countries are below 2.1 replacement level. That demographic number means something. That 2.1 means how many children per woman are needed to maintain our labor force. And we are all, not all, but mostly operating below that level. What does that mean? As our labor force ages, more persons are coming out of the labor force than coming in. Added to that is the Caribbean region where we know high youth unemployment exists, low training exists. Our population not in economic activity, education and training are very high at the youth levels. So as we narrow that population pyramid to the top, what is the replacement? Are we training? Are we engaging? Are we empowering our youth? And looking at some of the findings, because I'm not the marquee event, so I'm going through a little quickly, what we did see is where are the differences between male and female. Now, as I said, the research raised more questions than we anticipated, which is not a bad thing. That's what we want. One of the things we noticed was that at the surface level, we are seeing male and females reporting the same in terms of equity of opportunity, equity in promotion, and they are reporting similarly when it comes to this fear of discrimination, although it is higher for our female respondents. When we dug deeper into the data, there are certain other dynamics we as Caribbean policymakers need to now consider, because the dichotomy between the private sector and the public sector when it comes to these variables is stark. We have to look at, we have these employment rights, we have these treaties we have signed on to. Are they passing on to the public sector? Are we seeing that equality of treatment and engagement in the public sector? Another thing that was critical came at the younger age working populations. The increased gender consciousness has benefited us. We're seeing early signs. The 18 to 24 categories are reporting similarly, meaning myself as a male, I am concerned about the treatment to my female peers, and it's coming out in the data when it comes there. But as we look at the elder persons in the working population, the middle persons in the working population, there's a generational transmission of that inequity that exists. So we have to consider that, because as we speak to the concepts of migration, as we speak to the concepts of elongating working life, we need to fairly engage with everyone for longer. It's clear-cut. I will go to what is very important, there's no doubt about it, the indigenous populations. We heard it last night, we have a narrowing workforce. How do we increase our ability to produce? How do we increase production? Part of that, yes, is migration, yes, is looking for external labor, but it's also optimizing the labor that we do have. So it's about reaching everyone, those disconnected communities, reaching those disconnected populations, and it's showing up yet again in the data. I'm not running through the charts, you are clearly seeing that. But what is running through is, how do we reduce their fear of discrimination in the workplace and engage with them? In many ways, COVID has been a baseline, not only as a statistician. When I hear policymakers speak, COVID is now our reference point. During COVID, when we had to digitalize education, when we had to digitalize the workplace to a greater degree, these poor and vulnerable populations were being disproportionately affected. Did they have access to the technology? Did they have access to the markets? So as we speak about a more digitalized world, that problem remains. COVID or no COVID, how do we make sure everyone is trained in using the technology and can participate in the labor market? And how do we address these concerns of harassment, of engagement, of promotion, and of accessing opportunities? CDB has also been doing work on disability. Our recent disability report for 2024 highlighted that our disabled population still face a significant amount of discrimination, neglect, and marginalization in labor markets. We are speaking about making sure we don't fall into this aging trap where we lose more workers faster than we can attract. Migration is very critical, I will not discount that. But equally as we worry about those leaving, we should worry about how do we engage with those inside. It requires that we have equal rights to work and opportunities to gain a living for the disabled population, providing the financial support, providing the infrastructure to participate, and to make sure we have inclusive physical and mental spaces. You won't see this one in the chart, and I want to bring it out, the LGBTQI population, because as we did engage with them, but we couldn't even get this deep into the analysis, because the clear-cut answers we were getting, they still feel unable to speak. So they weren't coming forward with some of the responses. I don't view that as a limitation to the research. That is a critical finding we need to take forward. How do we create equal and opportunities that we can make them open and honest in communication? I'll close with some of the key messages. And just to say, over the last 2 years, CDB has been very actively involved with engaging with our constituents. We had the Basic Needs Trust Fund capacity assessment and survey of our beneficiaries. This was done at the community level of our Basic Needs Trust Fund, and we spoke to the communities who were benefiting. We had the disability report, this report, as I mentioned, and ongoing country gender assessments. All the messages continue to be coherent, cohesive, and congruent to these words: advocacy, voice, communication, inclusion, collaboration. And what is major, it's no longer a matter of having persons represent the views of our poor and vulnerable population. They want to be representing themselves. They want to be included when we have these discussions, not as members of the audience, but members up here speaking. And if we want to take this forward, it's about making sure these words aren't spoken to, but spoken with our populations. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. That was delivered with a lot of rigor and vigor, so I thank you for that, particularly after lunch. We have a really great panel this afternoon. Again, thank you, partnerships with StatsCan as well as the World Bank. The World Bank is our partner of choice today. as well as StatsCan. We're very happy to have Minister Jordan from the government of Barbados and UE represented in Halima. I'm going to kick it off with the first question for the panel, and they'll have about 2 minutes each just to answer this, just to set the tone about what we mean by equality in the workplace and in our labor markets. What does that mean for whether it's sex, gender, ethnicity, class, then Dale just added sexuality. What does that mean? And by the way, sexuality could also mean a gender spectrum now. So each of you, 2 minutes, maybe starting with the minister.
Thank you very much, and thanks to CDB for allowing me the opportunity to be a participant in this, I agree, important discussion. I will speak to the idea of inclusion, maybe by using an example, since I only have 2 minutes. And to say that for us as a government, and maybe in particular as a minister, I think it can be illustrated by maybe the first piece of legislation that we passed in the House of Assembly as a Ministry of Labor. And that was our Employment Prevention of Discrimination Act. And I'll list the areas that we specifically list in our legislation to speak to the whole matter of inclusion. It is illegal to discriminate, and this discrimination is both in the creation of jobs, recruitment to jobs, as well as employment as it exists. So not just employment, but also creation of jobs and recruitment. The areas that I believe represent inclusion are race, origin, political opinion, trade union affiliation, color, creed, sex, sexual orientation, social status, marital status, domestic partnership status, pregnancy, maternity, family responsibility, medical condition, disability, age, physical feature. And these we have listed specifically so that we make it clear as to what we mean by inclusion. The labor market, if we are, like we heard earlier, to engage not just talking about those who may come into the labor market, but those who are already there, we have to make sure that we maximize their involvement, engagement, and their work. And so I think I'll use that as an illustration of what we mean by inclusion, saying that we are not discriminating in these areas.
I particularly like the one on physical, because I didn't expect to hear that. So thank you, that's very progressive. I'm going to pass it on now to Oscar. Oscar Calvo-Gonzalez is the Regional Director for Economics, Finance and Investment for the LAC region of the World Bank. Oscar, what's your response to that the first question?
Thank you, Therese. And let me first thank the opportunity. It's especially pleasant to be under the banner of partnerships. We are definitely trying to collaborate a lot more. So in answer to your question, so one way to think about it is that we want people to have sort of like the same access to opportunities, for which requires that first we need to work on the assets, human capital. So we need to build on the skills of everyone. And we also need to work on what we call agency or voice, which is the ability to actually make use of those opportunities. There will be lots of details on, like, there's like regulatory frameworks like the minister was talking about. There are like social norms angles that we touch upon. So it's a really comprehensive agenda. And the last thing I'll say is that specifically on gender, we pay a lot of attention at the bank. We recently had our board of executive directors, and I recognize our executive director here, discuss the gender strategy, one of just a couple of strategies that we have at the bank.
Thank you. Moving to you, Halima. Dr. Halima Deschong is from the Institute for Gender and Development at Cave Hill in Barbados.
Thank you very much, and I really want to say I appreciate being a part of this conversation. I think just listening to Barbados's employment rights policy gives me much inspiration, because it speaks to both shifting the structural conditions of inequality as well as particular practices, being intentional about shifting those arrangements. But picking up where Oscar left off around gender, I also wanted to say that as we think about equity, justice, and equality in employment, we have to link it to larger structural and historical conditions. Because if we treat the labor market, and I'm happy Dindial mentioned that in your presentation, if we treat the labor market only as the public paid labor market, then we're missing the unpaid care labor that underwrites economies. So we have to find a way of being intentional in our creation of policies and actions. What we have as the current setup, we know for the large part, women are the majority caregivers. They engage in more unpaid care work. So what does that mean? Yes, we know countries have childcare facilities and child policies, but they're childcare policies, but they're insufficient. We also know that women are largely responsible for elder care and care for those who cannot care for themselves because of illness. So the policies we put in place have to account for that. And there are several studies that point to ways in which we could do better at ensuring that we account for that in our counting, in our research, but also in our policy making. So for me, and when we are doing that work, part of why I appreciate this initial study is because it understands that even within categories we are different. So when we are talking about women, we are talking about women with disabilities. When we are talking about youth, we are talking about rural youth. When we are talking about indigenous people, we are talking about differently located indigenous people. So when we are thinking about equity, justice, and equality, we have to think about shifting the structural conditions and being intentional in our policy making. And I do like where Dindial ended, nothing about me without me. So that this panel is really great and important, but the kind of hard work that we have to do with communities. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Just to comment on that, though, in terms of the indigenous peoples, we had a forum, I can remember yesterday. It seemed like a longer time than that. And right now, there's a youth forum going on. So these two particular communities are being engaged very actively by the CDB, and it's not the first time we're doing it. Vincent Dale, Director General for Labor Market, Education and Socioeconomic Wellbeing Statistics from Stats Canada. Your view, and we're going to probe more on the well-being a bit later in this conversation.
Okay. You can hear me? First of all, thank you very much for including me in your event. As you know, Stats Canada has had a long history working with countries in the Caribbean, most recently through the project for the regional advancement of statistics in the Caribbean. So I'm hoping that I can continue that tradition and inform the discussion this afternoon. In terms of responding to your question, maybe the best way to address it is to speak to a project which has sort of informed our work around diversity and inclusion since 2021. Similar to the presentation, the experience of the pandemic, I think, revealed certain disparities within Canadian economy and society. So part of the government response to that was the Disaggregated Data Action Plan. So one way of thinking of this is it covers 4 groups which are identified under the Canadian Employment Equity Act. 4 groups against whom discrimination is illegal under that act. So it's women, racialized groups, Indigenous people, and persons with disabilities. So that would be my definition of the scope of the population. But maybe more importantly is some principles around disaggregated data action plan. The first is that our statistics should be speaking to the lowest level of the lowest level of population group possible. So, for example, within the racialized group in Canada, there's great differences, for example, between Asian Canadians and Black Canadians. So, it's the idea of further disaggregate within groups. A second principle is intersectional analysis. So, an observation that applies to women and racialized people, but what's the intersection between race and gender? Third is to drive the connection between statistics and decision making, the use of approved standards across government. So, for example, defining an employment equity group is not necessarily straightforward. It can be challenging. And then lastly is, I'm sure this is similar in the Caribbean, but there's lots of geographical diversity within Canada. So it's the principle that we should be pushing our statistics to the not necessarily the lowest level of geography, but the level of geography at which decisions are made. So in Canada, we have great differences east to west, north to south. So that would be the final principle of the disaggregated data action plan.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that really sets the tone in terms of bringing us all up on the same page in terms of what we mean by equality in the labor market. I'm going to switch it up now and turn my attention to Oscar. The Latin American and Caribbean Equity Lab did some research to show that highlighted labor income accounts for as much as 80% of total income for the poorest quintiles in society. CDB has done similar work showing that that is consistent, but that the impact is seen and is very pervasive, especially when it comes to incomes, opportunities for growth, and labor market participation. So giving this kind of glaring statistic, what are some of the solutions? What are the policies? How can we reduce this income inequality gap that exists? And really, what stands out as some really good things to do, and what should we be doing?
Thank you. So the first thing to say actually is that we have some of that data now for Caribbean countries. We're very, very pleased to have this data for decision-making project with the OECS, and we are producing data for the Caribbean and jointly as well. So congratulations to a lot of you in the audience. So one thing I'll say is that yes, and so not only jobs are the main source of income for the transitions out of poverty, but jobs are truly transformational on other dimensions. So jobs are important for living standards, as we said. Jobs are important for productivity growth, and jobs are important for social cohesion. And so if we think about it in that way, what we see is that for productivity growth, what you actually require is churning, so creative destruction. Productivity increases when workers that have been stuck in a way in low productivity firms move actually to higher productivity firms. And so there's a tension there because you do require some destruction of jobs and some creation of jobs to actually generate this productivity increase. At the same time, jobs are a source of dignity, identity, as I said, trust in institutions. And so you can see that there's a potential tension between these two things. So I can understand why policymakers are hesitant to sort of like, when you see job destruction, there is a threat to the society. But in a way, you need to balance these things. So it's quite important to get, in a way, the fundamentals right. I know it sounds obvious, but without growth, there is not going to be good jobs. And so it's not sufficient, but it's necessary. So you need to get fundamentals right. You need to then almost worry more about not just labor market policies, but things outside of the labor market that will be able to create the demand for those jobs. Of course, there's a supply on the skills, and there's like lots of work to do on that front too. But for small island economies, one of the challenges is that where's that dynamism going to come from? There's no scale, so you need to sort of like think of like what type of outward orientation, what type of openness you need to be able to get exposed to those ideas, technologies, etc., that will help increase productivity. So jobs, in a way, it's you interact most with your colleagues at work, right? You spend most of your working hours with it. So the source of jobs is the source of like ideas and the potential for growth. So so any policy that, especially for small islands, that connects more with the global economy is going to be helpful for that. I'll stop here.
Thank you. That reminds me of a couple of things P.B. Scott said last night. It's having the right conditions to attract new job-creating pools, so to speak. So I think we're all seized on that. But I thank you for that, and I totally agree. I'm going to switch now back to the minister, because the International Trade Union Confederation do biennial global surveys of how workers feel about their jobs, whether they're happy or not happy. And looking at the pre-COVID survey results and post-COVID results, in Barbados, for example, or not just Barbados, but what our research looked at when we were comparing the two types of findings for these periods is that pre-COVID, workers were concerned about access to jobs, salaries, and wage differentials. Since 2020, however, the concerns have shifted, and they're mostly now around the social contract. Barbados has a lot of history with that. Sustainability of employment and incomes. And this is the one that I think is tricky and we're all grappling with, and anxiety around the changing world of work. I'll give an example of that. There's still managers who think that in 2024, we can insist that folks show up for work 5 days a week. Well, during COVID, productivity still was maintained in some organizations, I'm not saying all, and staff were working from home. So this sort of, I need you in the office all the time attitude is not really, doesn't make sense in 2024. So from your vantage point, given Barbados's social contract, what is resonating with you? Does any of this resonate with you? Is this what you're hearing? Is these are the sort of concerns Barbadians are channeling to the Ministry of Labor? What do you think are some of these issues, and how do we deal with these concerns that come out very clearly in the results?
The results of the research, I think, mirror what we're seeing in Barbados with respect to a movement from only maybe technical areas of concern to including, you mentioned social contract, how we relate to each other, employers and workers. So we are seeing that. Now, there is one statement that I remember, and I think this statement was made in 2020, that still rings in my mind. We brought together these social partners, and in particular, because we are a tourism-dominated economy, and so we rely on hotels and restaurants, we want to make sure that our hotels didn't just disappear, because whenever COVID was over, even though there are some people who probably weren't sure if COVID was ever going to be over, we need to make sure that these hotels could still function. So one of the things we addressed was the Severance Payments Act. And we made a temporary adjustment to the Act with the agreement of employers and workers. One worker said in the Lloyd Erskine Sandy First Center, I remember very clearly, "I hope that you remember us after this." That statement says a whole lot. There's a recognition that the social compact means that we have to work in the best interest of the country. But it recognizes that there is some level of mistrust. The relationship is not really where it needs to be. Barbados has been doing a lot of work in making the relationship as solid as we can. And the Prime Minister uses a phrase, when I see Partnership for Resilient Prosperity, she used the term, share the burden, share the bounty. That was one of our rallying cries from a social compact, social partnership perspective, to say to employers, business owners, and workers, and the general population, that we are in a period of difficulty. And so there's going to be the need for sharing. There's going to be challenge, and coming off the challenge, we expect some level of prosperity. So there will need to be that sharing. Beside those maybe philosophical positions, we did some concrete things to address the challenge that occurred, so that in April 2021, we established for the first time a national minimum wage. Now, we were told, this is the middle of COVID, a national minimum wage. We were told, as a matter of fact, some of the discussion that I had during this period reminded me of some of the discussions that Ian and I used to have when we said he was a Lipsy man and I was a Hardwick man. But the whole idea of recognizing that workers have to eat in order to be engaged, in order to be able to participate fully in work and production, they have to be able to eat. And so we established a national minimum wage in 2021. We also worked to strengthen the social partnership. And so we had social partnership meetings, and this is the full social partnership chaired by the Prime Minister, much more frequently than we had before. Now, when I say before, I mean before we came into office, because we came into office and we recognized that where we were economically needed everybody to be on board to get us past. But like we heard earlier, COVID presented a new benchmark. And so to get through the COVID period, the pandemic and all of its impacts, we had to make sure that the country continued to be on board. During that period, we engaged all the social partners, as we usually did, but we also engaged the opposition, the political opposition, because this, for us, had to be a whole-of-country approach. We were in uncharted waters, and so in order to be able to get out of it, there had to be the compact, you call it that, there had to be an understanding across society that we're in this together, and we have to move, to work together to move beyond this. We also, and I'm going to say this very quickly, we established what we call a prices compact, where we engage workers, government, and employers, engage to say to businesses, hold your markups at a particular level for a defined period of time and on a defined range of goods. So we did that. We also established, we signed on to a mission economy. We established minimum rates of pay and conditions of work for construction in relation to public contracts. Excuse me. And we most recently addressed the matter of labor clauses, so conditions of work, rates of pay with respect to businesses that receive concessions from government. Now, that was not without its long discussions, but government and I leading the policy making in the Ministry of Labor, we were quite clear. Workers are the backbone of economy and economic development. And if we do not treat to workers as we would treat to, there's machinery and you're told to service it every X number of years, every X number of miles. You also have to recognize that human beings also have to be treated with a certain level of respect in regards to their pay, their conditions of work. And a lot of what we have done has been to address the whole matter of pay conditions to ensure that workers are able to be productive. We had a survey a few years ago which indicated, and I remembered it when you spoke earlier about people in 2024 still believing that you need to be at work 5 days a week. One of my mentors referred to that as presenteeism. So, this view that because you are there at a desk that you are working, well, I don't want to say all of us know differently, because I think that when we are at our desks that we are working, but there are lots of people who are at the desk and not working. So,
Minister, we're going to get to come back to you. I want to give my panelists equal time, but a lot of what you just said resonated with the economists in this room, because To get growth, it means that we need to change that equation, right? Total factor productivity has to do with labor and capital. So if labor is underperforming, as Ian would tell you, sure you had lots of those conversations, you can't get the output from labor that we need. And that brings me to Halima. And as the minister also raised the question of tourism and what happened during COVID with the collapse of that industry, and so many jobs were lost in tourism, and not only because tourism is linked in many of our economies across this region with the informal sector, the part of the labor force participation rate that you see for women on those charts, the piece that's missing are the women who are doing a lot of informal work. So, Halima, what do we need to do to address something you already alluded to, the unpaid work, the informal workers, in these particularly in those economies where the service-oriented part of the economy is very big, and that's the majority of countries in the Caribbean that are so heavily dependent on tourism.
Okay, so when we talk about policy, what is good in the Caribbean is that we are seeing more and more intentional policies around equal pay for equal work and so on. But those are not occasioning the kinds of rapid shifts required to make societies more just for everyone. So for example, in the tourism industry, women earn 14.7% less than men. And we also know that women are bunched in the lower paying jobs in the tourism industry. They're the ones who suffered most during COVID as a consequence of lockdowns, and we know the borders were shut and so on. We also know that majority of women who work in the tourism industry work shifts. 8 to 4 is when childcare facilities operate. And we also know that sometimes the arrangements to see workers go to and from work safely are often missing. So when we talk about policy shifts that need to happen, we need to look at the nature of work in the tourism industry. We need to pay attention to small tourism businesses as well, where a lot of women are located, where a lot of the most vulnerable workers are located, and who again suffered the most coming out of COVID. And another category of workers, you spoke about informality. Migration and travel feature in how work is organized in the region. We could think about domestic workers in the region as domestic workers move. What is good, we have domestic workers organizations in the region, and they actually have the answers around how their work could be more structured, they could be better remunerated, there could be better policies at the level of the state to protect them, the kind of social protections that we saw in some cases implemented, but in other cases missing. So for example, I think it was only Barbados and the Bahamas who actually had employment protection arrangements prior to COVID, but a number of countries like St. Vincent and the Grenadines and others in the region implemented temporary measure to protect those mostly workers in the tourism industry. What COVID has taught us is the need for pre-planning, the need to be more upfront and to anticipate what shocks mean. We know that those made most marginal in society are the ones who are going to be most affected in times of crisis, but we always feel like we are crisis planning. And so I do believe that our policies need to address social stratification in order to address the inequalities that you mentioned. So I would say there's a kind of urgent need for tourism development organizations and policymakers to collaborate on ensuring they adhere gender analysis and gender responsive policy planning to account for some of those inequalities that we don't see at work, but they're very much so connected to work.
Yeah, thank you. We're going to get back to you again to go a little bit deeper on that. Vincent, this is a kind of tricky one because I'm still fascinated by the socioeconomic well-being statistics that you're also in charge of. But our policies around labor market equity and sustainable inclusivity, when we are trying to analyze, are these policies working, we find that there's a lack of evidence. how are you either building up the evidence, and you talked earlier about disaggregated data at very granular level. So help us understand, because across our region, I think we can learn a lot from Canada in terms of what should we be monitoring and how do we collect that data. Can you share some thoughts with us on that?
Sure. I don't know if I'm controlling the microphone or if somebody else is controlling. Okay. Maybe I can answer both your questions at the same time. So we've recently developed a quality of life framework, which drives our thinking on socioeconomic well-being. So that emerged from the Beyond GDP literature, the Sarkozy report, et cetera. So in a very basic sense, it's a recognition that policymaking should be driven not only by economic indicators like GDP, employment, income, but also aspects of social well-being. So the health of the population, the health of the environment, similar to what the minister said, the health of public trust in institutions, sense of belonging, sense of optimism. So we've elaborated a sort of a framework of quality of life indicators with the intention of tracking those in the same way that we track GDP every quarter. We would be tracking these measures of quality of life on a periodic basis. Within labor, what that has meant, within the labor market information program, what that has meant is a much greater emphasis on not just the quantity of employment, but the quality of employment. So aspects of job security, access to training and development and in the workplace, et cetera. The other thing I'll mention is an important part of this framework is it is a whole of government initiative. It's not only the National Statistics Office. So it actually originated in our Ministry of Finance. It was kind of co-developed by the Ministry of Finance, the NSO. And it's at least strives to build this into decision-making within government. So for example, a department that submits a Treasury Board submission or a budget approval request has to demonstrate that the initiative will contribute to the quality of life indicators.
Thank you. Thank you. Lots to think about that. I'm going to do a second round of questions to the panelists, and then I'm going to open up the floor because I have this monitor here that is tracking us to 2:45. So starting with you, Oscar, maybe something about your independent evaluation group highlighted improvements that are needed to respond to challenges in implementation of the programs to support Indigenous peoples. Looking at things like cultural differences, geographical constraints, affordability of services, lack of accurate data. Can you share any lessons with us on the experience so far in implementing projects that take the differential impact and opportunities of vulnerable populations into the design of some of the work that World Bank is doing? Do you have enough there?
Sure.
Okay.
And by chance, I actually happened to be in the independent evaluation group when that report was produced. But so what I would say is that, in a sense, if there's one message, the what is relatively straightforward. So and it's not just Indigenous, but like lots of other things. We were talking about childcare. Yes, of course, we need to provide childcare. The information on what sort of like jobs are paying, building up skills through training programs, so reskilling, the support. The difficult, and this is the lesson, is that these are really weak link problems where the smallest thing gets in the way and then derails implementation. So is the smallest thing like, yes, the time of the school is 8 to 4. If you have to be at work at 8, you cannot make it happen. And so we see that quite frequently. We were talking to the Albanian authorities recently on precisely this challenge. Or you have training programs where you recruit the people, they show up, but but quickly thereafter they don't turn up to the class, and you don't have a way of reaching out to them, because when you did the intake, you didn't actually get sufficient sort of like touch points. We had that experience in Argentina. Speaking of indigenous, it's not enough to sort of like have consultations and sort of like design the materials, but you actually need to bring them on board on your program to be able to sustain that engagement over time. So, that's one big lesson. There's some upside to this, which is that sometimes seemingly small interventions can actually have very good results. And so when I look at all those data charts on the female labor force participation is relatively low, I see, that's a lot of potential. There's a lot of new entrants to the labor force that could really come in. And sometimes interventions, there's a very famous one that is just simply providing information, in this case to men, about the appropriateness of, say, women entering the labor force. And so, it's like they call this pluralistic ignorance, but you can think of it as peer pressure. In some settings, men believe that this is not the type of job that is appropriate for their wife, but they actually believe that partly because they think everybody else thinks that way, not because they individually think that way. And so if you can provide information that actually, no, other men also think it's appropriate for women to take a job at night, or to take a job in the city, or to take a job that's sort of like it's in manufacturing or mechanical, etc. That can actually have an impact. And so there's a lot of work to do on these issues of information/social norms that can have relatively high payoffs. But the biggest thing is, of course, you need to sweat the small stuff. All these small details can really get in the way of effective implementation.
Thank you. I think we can use some of those same lessons to help us understand why we're having some implementation issues in our region, especially with CDB projects. Minister, can I turn back to you? And this came up last night too in the lecture. The fact that Barbados has a population that has a negative population replacement rate, right? I think yours is like 1.6? 1.6 when the equilibrium is something like 2.1. So that means, as we heard earlier, more people retiring, fewer people working. PB Scott mentioned last night that this is probably a good because this is not just happening in Barbados, it's the trend around the region with few exceptions. In terms of what can we do as an impulse to the labor market, are the policies to get more equity? Could labor market equity help to reverse this trend, at least in terms of keeping people in jobs longer? But what are some of the other things your government may be thinking about in terms of addressing this issue? Because, as we heard last night, and as you already know, this will soon become an issue, not just for productivity and growth, but it'll become a strain on the budget if fewer people are contributing in terms of taxes and contributions to the budget to maintain an aging population. I think that's, and by the way, this is a phenomenon in Latin America and the Caribbean that's pretty acute right now, against the backdrop of pension liabilities that are mostly unfunded. That's a lot there, but just what are you doing about it?
So if I start with the last thing you mentioned with respect to pension liabilities, so I happen to be the minister responsible for Social Security as well. When we got our most recent actuarial review, we recognized that we had a potential problem. And we made a decision as government that we would face it and we would deal with it. So that we have done two things with respect to Social Security. We have engaged in what we call a revitalization. All the policies in that revitalization were not, immediately embraced, because one of them, for example, is a change in the pensionable age from the current 67 to 68 in 2034. Now, these are real solutions to real potential problems. So there is not going to be some magical thing that's going to happen to reverse. But what we said, and the Prime Minister has been quite strong on presenting this, is that if the economy starts to behave in maybe in a different way, we could reverse some of those things. So done based on where we are, but not written in stone. Now, in terms of the economy responding a little bit differently, we've been of the view that migration and managed migration has to be part of the solution. While we have agreed, the cabinet has in principle agreed to paternity leave, for example. And in my head, I'm thinking about paternity, parental. We also think about expanding maternity leave. But all the research that I've reviewed suggests to me that decisions on children, either children or number of children, is not really based on how much leave you get or tax incentives, because there have been lots of countries that have tried to give incentives, and those incentives haven't really worked based on the research that I've done. So managed migration, we had a population committee, and we recognize that we need more people in the economy, more people producing. Our 2021 census shows that our population has declined. So it's not just aging, but we were at 267, and many of us Barbadians used to talk about the fact that we are 280, we're probably going to 300. Now we realize that we've fallen to below 270. So there is a challenge, and we've done something. So the matter of migration, though, is not the easiest one to sell to some of our countries, and P.B. Scott, I think, hinted to it last night when he spoke about the fact that we are dots in the ocean, but we feel that we're big, 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 and we can do everything, we can keep up to everybody, not recognizing that, we got to do this thing together. And thankfully, Barbados has a history in trying to work together. Sir Grantley and the Federation, Barrow and Carifta, and so we have that, Arthur and Motley with CSME. We recognize that we have to do this together, so that there has to be the movement. We agree to full free movement. In the legislation, we have added household domestics, agricultural workers, and private security officers to the list of persons who can move freely. But we're going to have to deal with this really together. We are supporting the ILO, and the IOM are working with CARICOM to put in place a regional migration policy. And we are fully in support of that. We ourselves are working to revise our migrant labor protocol, because we recognize that there are some issues there that we have to address. Last thing I'm going to say, in terms you talk about inclusive, trying to include, we recognize that adult literacy is something we have to address, because one of the things we've realized that keeps people out of the labor market is the inability, I don't know if I should call it inability, the challenges they have in terms of literacy. And that keeps a lot of particularly young men out of the labor market. So that is one of the things that we're going to be addressing with respect to bringing everybody into the labor market, one of those other issues.
Thanks, Mena. That's a very interesting observation, particularly since Barbados has a reputation for a very high level of literacy. I've never heard it articulated like that, so that's something else for us to think about. I'm conscious that it's 2:28, and there may be some questions from the audience that we'd like to take. Are there any hands up, or can I go around second round? There are mics. Recognizing Toussaint as the first one up.
Sure, thanks. I'm just hurrying so we can, in the interest of time. Two quick comments, if time permits. You can. I'd like to hear your comments on both. In relation to skilled labor structurally also may bring other skilled labor. Skilled male may move to a country or female and bring their spouse. you don't often hear about arrangements being made to be able to accommodate the possibility of that in the context of migration. And the second thing is, during the study that Dindale presented, there was an interesting slide, I don't know if we noticed it, that a majority of persons indicated that they did not suffer from any type of harassment in the workplace. But yet, there were more people reporting their belief that there was harassment in the workplace. So if time permits, I'd be happy to hear any comments on those two. Thanks.
Thank you. Maybe I take the second one and then we go to response.
I just want to find out from the panelists if they found that after COVID, this whole question of equity in the workplace, for example, for agricultural workers, there was a time when agricultural workers in the Caribbean were mainly born by women, women more so than men. After COVID, we have seen a drop in agricultural output. What has happened to this equity? Are you saying in construction, for example, and high-skilled jobs, we want to find out, are you retraining people in the Caribbean? Because it means that we may have to retrain more and more of our people. And then the final question has to tie in with this, the question of literacy. Now, literacy, and I think the moderator mentioned it, that we used to say we have 98% literacy. How do we define literacy in a modern world where technology is driving everything? For example, I may be able to read or write. I can read, I can write, but I don't understand if the technology now. Is that literacy? And how do you address it?
Yeah, thank you. These are really very interesting points. I want Dindale to just take the mic 1 second on Toussaint's question about the issue of the perception of harassment versus the actual data. And on this point, as he's, no, come. Just to say that this is where data is fascinating, right? Because our perception and reality tend to differ a lot. So go ahead.
Yeah, on? Yeah, thanks. And it's interesting, Toussaint would ask that question because if we think about the corruption perception index, a lot of times you never suffered corruption, you weren't part of corruption, but you have a perception of corruption. And I think it's the same concept in the workplace. It may not have affected me or impacted me, but I see it happening, or I see conditions that I think foster that level of favoritism, harassment, bullying. And it still speaks, and I think we need to pat ourselves on the back. We have communicated with our labor markets, our stakeholders, our populations, and they understand the concepts. So that widening of the perception has to do with the fact that they understand, they are aware, and they recognize when it happens. Yeah.
Thanks, Dindale. Minister, I think maybe you would like to address the issue raised by this gentleman here about, one, literacy, but two, also the skilled aspect.
Now, literacy, I think, used to be defined as the ability to read and write, as High Commissioner put. But there's functional literacy. So you can read and write, but do you understand? Are you able to engage in a workplace that is increasingly technological? So we have now also the whole idea of literacy, digital literacy, so literacy from a technology perspective. The world has changed, is changing, and so the idea of literacy, meaning the ability, literacy providing the ability to engage, the ability to understand, the ability to respond, that is where we're seeing the challenge. And if the labor market is to be inclusive, then we have to address those challenges to make sure that there's the inclusion. We had, for example, during the lockdowns, situations where we found out that even though the island is covered by internet connectivity, there are some homes that don't have internet connectivity. There are some homes where mothers had to leave a phone with 2 or 3 children, so only one could. All these impact the ability to get to the point of literacy that will allow a person to function. And so I think we have to make sure that we understand that the definitions change as the world of work is changing, And we have to make sure that our educational systems respond to that and allow for persons who are not yet there. And that's the reason why I highlighted adult. There are persons who are not yet there who need to get there if they're to be included.
And on the skills issue? The question about skills, and Toussaint raised about one person moving and...
The rights of migrants. No, that is something that CARICOM is working through. But as a government and as a country, we support and we've been very clear from early on, that if a worker moves, that worker's spouse ought to be able to access employment. That worker's children ought to be able to access education, just like how the children who are born in Barbados access education. We have been very clear that this whole matter of regional integration, the CSME, the working together as a Caribbean, we believe none of our islands are going to be able to succeed alone. Whether you have tourism, oil, bauxite, it doesn't matter. We're too small. We have to do it together. And so we cannot do it assuming that a person comes, and that's where we support full free movement. You can't just come, we're not talking about migrant workers or who are seasonal. You come and you go back home. We're talking about people who have the freedom to move around and to be able to keep their families together as they move around. As a matter of fact, that's probably the only way they're going to be fully productive and engaged in any case.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Maybe I can turn, are there any more questions from the floor? If not, I will ask. We still have about 9 minutes. I can get to questions, Stefano?
Thank you. My question is on the problem of migration of young abroad, and from yesterday to today. My question is a bit of hearing from public, from university, academia, how to make a youngster stay in the Caribbean with a perspective of plan of growth, of development of themselves. Because I don't believe the problem is just salaries, the economics, it's how they see the future in the Caribbean instead of, as yesterday also the lecturer was saying, they see themselves having perspective of growth opportunities abroad. So how to have a regional approach on this? Thank you.
Thanks, Stefano. Oscar, would you like to, I think a lot of countries grapple with this, right? So.
Yes, and so to my mind, so I was talking earlier that countries have specific challenges. So small island is a type of challenge, youth unemployment is a different type of challenge, which may generate the push to migrate. So when I was saying look outside the labor market, this is exactly the type of thing I was thinking of, is like, maybe it's just that you don't have, in a sense, contestable markets, enough competition, open access, and opportunities, and so you are reacting to that. So if your main challenge is disengaged youth or youth that are discouraged from looking for opportunities in the current labor market, maybe the entire set of protections that you are affording to both workers and firms are actually discouraging that. And so that's a margin where you want to be focusing on, because that is your main challenge. I know we are almost out of time, but I really did want to say one thing on this issue of like what comes first, jobs or skills, because I think the question was really spot on. There's some skills that are required, including digital literacy, for jobs. But jobs also pull skills from others, because you are engaging with others that have, other ideas, other skills, and you are able to actually build on that. So sometimes you don't need, in a sense, to have like top-notch skills to begin with to be able to generate like some positive dynamics. I'll stop there. No, that's.
Thank you. I'd like Halima just to weigh in on this question before I take the last one.
Thank you. As he asked the question, I thought immediately about youth and the kind of vibrancy of youth and this desire to explore. I also know that we are a region inundated by US, global North media. And the attraction is real, and we cannot deny that as a reality. I do think we have to make sure that we create youth-centered opportunities, imagination, that youth see themselves here, that they are part of the creating and visioning of their own societies. Because that is when they begin to see the society as belonging to them and them playing a role in building the society. But opportunities are absolutely crucial. If we do not have the macroeconomic context, the political economy context that creates opportunity for youth, then we are invariably going to lose our youth. Because youth do say they want to stay, they want to be part of building and creating our Caribbean. It is their Caribbean, they own this Caribbean. But outside of those real opportunities, the structural inequalities that persist, we are going to lose a large proportion of our youth.
That's a very salutary point.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, I wanted to comment further on the matter of youth unemployment and unemployability, and the fact that the number of young persons in the region who are not contributing to taxes, are not contributing to Social Security, and are likely to become a burden on the state in the next couple of years. And whether there's been any kind of thought about this and projections as to how you'll be able to deal with the safety nets for those young people who have nothing to fall back on when they turn 60, 70, 80 down the road.
Thank you. I think, Minister, you're best placed to answer that.
The matter of young people, and I think we know that young people are not, like some of us older ones, prepared to stay in an organization for 10, 15, 20 years. So they're part of gig economy, they're self-employed persons. One of the things we did in our reform of our Social Security was to make it easier for those persons to contribute. Now, there is both carrot and stick. So there is a legal responsibility to participate. But when a person is on a platform in Barbados working for a US or Canadian company, we may not know. We have to make it easier for those persons to participate. So there's this sensitizing that you need. 70 will come unless you die early. 70 will come, 80 will come. You will need Social Security. You will need that social protection. So we've made it easier. From the 1st of January this year, we say that persons who are self-employed, categorized as self-employed, can pay at any time during the year. Lump sum, 2 payments, 3 payments, it doesn't matter when. You can pay on January 1st, December 31st. We have to make it easier for people who do their transactions sitting on their beds at 2 in the morning to be able to participate. It is just where we are. And I think that at the policy level, we have to adjust our approaches and our interventions to suit the reality. So we can't just continue thinking, well, you know, you have to fill out a form, you have to go into national insurance, you got to put it in the drop box. That's not where we are. So you can pay online, you can pay at any time during the year, and I think that is one area with respect to social protection in later years. And we realize that this is not just for people in their 50s and 60s, this is for younger people, our youth. We need to get them involved in looking after their pensionable years, but we need to do it in a way that allows them the flexibility to participate.
I like the last question. I'm going to pose the last question to Vincent, just because I think my economics department would love it if I asked this question. But it has to do with data. Data today is gold. StatsCan is probably one of the statistical agencies around the world that's almost gold standard in terms of how you collect data, how you publish that data, how you interact with the people who report to you and help to collect that data. It would be wrong if I didn't say that in our region we struggle with that. So share with us some of the strategies that StatsCan has used over the years to collect data and to engage with the Canadian population on the importance of the data. And so, Vincent.
Okay, thank you for that very broad question. You know, it's a challenge, it's a continuing challenge to maintain the trust of Canadians so that they furnish the data to us. Yes, that's true. I would say more recently our focus has been on the life cycle of data. So once we've received the data, what happens to it? And think of ourselves not just as a collector and a distributor of data, but embedded within a whole life cycle, a whole ecosystem of data. So there was a recent initiative within the Federal Public Service to really think about data strategically. So how do you think in terms of data being embedded within programs and services from the beginning? How does it flow to the NSO, and then how does it flow back to policymakers? So that raises questions of data flows, data access, also data standards, interoperability, so that different organizations are collecting data that can be combined together. Issues of data literacy, the ability to use data to make informed policy decisions, standards. So happy to point you to more information on that, but it's a relatively elaborated thinking around strategic use of data.
And lastly, let me just say that we're really grateful for the work that you've done with the region on the labor market information systems. So that work continues, and we're very happy for the partnership. My last task is to thank my panelists. Please join me in congratulating them on a really good discussion.